Hello, this is Robert Moynihan on Monday, April 7th, with Mike McCormick, speaking to you from Washington, D.C. Welcome, Mike.
Thanks, Robert. Good to see you again.
Mike, we know that you've been covering the connections between the White House and figures in the Catholic Church, and among those figures, prominently was Cardinal Theodore McCarrick, and Cardinal McCarrick just passed away.
Right.
And therefore, I wanted to bring you on again and talk to you about Cardinal McCarrick, his life, and the effect he had on the church, and have a discussion about this man who was at the intersection between the church, the American government, the Vatican, and the U.S. Church, and therefore a very important figure in our time. He was born on July 7th, 1930, in New York City. As a young boy, about 3 years old, he was orphaned when his father died and was thereafter raised by a single mother. He was educated at Fordham University and at the Catholic University of America, and ordained a priest in 1958 when he was 28 years old. He then rose through the church hierarchy, serving first in various roles in the Archdiocese of New York, and then he was appointed Auxiliary Bishop of New York in 1977, a long time ago now, almost 50 years, and 48 years ago. He became the bishop then of Metuchen, New Jersey, 1981. This is the beginning of the pontificate of Pope Benedict. He then became
Pope John Paul.
I'm sorry, Pope John Paul. Yeah.
Right.
And then he was the Archbishop of Newark, New Jersey, starting in 1986. So in 14 years, he was in Newark, and then he was appointed the Archbishop of the arguably most important see politically in the country, Archbishop of Washington, D.C., right at the heart of our government. After that, in 2001, he was created a cardinal by Pope John Paul II. And in terms of his life, there were rumors and internal complaints against him for many, many years, starting maybe in the late 80s into the 90s. And there were settlements about accusations of abusing seminarians in the dioceses of Metuchen and Newark, settlements in 2005 and 2007, quite early on. He's still a cardinal. Some church officials were reportedly aware of these things, and this is why Archbishop Vigano, who was at a desk in Rome in those years, had a dossier in 2006 in which he said there's really a lot of evidence here of serious misbehavior and something should be done. And he passed that up with a kind of asterisk on the dossier, important, to his Secretary of State, who at the time handed it on to Pope Benedict XVI. And what we believe happened is Benedict XVI said, you have to, they didn't know, as far as I understand, that there would be any criminal activity, but abuse activity involving people in young men. And this is when the story of McCarrick becomes ever more murky. And he was allegedly told to step away from public life entirely and to live a life really of repentance and prayer. But he never did that.
Right.
And so finally, all these things came to a head in a public accusation surfacing in June of 2018.
I think it was 2017.
Okay.
2017, and the investigation went for a full year, and then in 2018 they made.
That's right. That it came out and it was revealed, but that the Archdiocese of New York had judged the accusations credible.
Right.
And very quickly, he was in Rome, removed from his post and removed from the cardinalate. And then uh, a few months later, the Vatican conducted a private canonical trial in 2019. He was found guilty of sexual abuse and misconduct. He was laicized. That means he's no longer a priest. After that, he was called Mr. McCarrick in February 2019, so 6 years ago.
Mm.
And this created the sort of legend, the sad legend of the evil cardinal who had been at the height of power and had plummeted to the depths of being laicized and regarded as a terrible abuser. Criminal charges were filed in Massachusetts in 2021, and his lawyers raised the point that he was so old at that time and probably incompetent, so he never came to trial.
Mm-hmm.
And he's the first U.S. cardinal to face such criminal charges for sexual abuse. I wanted to say, as I said before the program began, that when we deal with someone who's just passed away 3 days ago, that we we care for the soul of that man. I met McCarrick. I had I had a lunch with him in Washington D.C. and I met him many times in Rome, very briefly. I met him also at the seminary in Washington D.C. and had an hour conversation. So I know the man, or knew the man, and I would say I pray for him and for his soul, despite all of these accusations. I pray for the forgiveness as he stands before the awesome judge. He's passed from this world, and since he's dead now, I want to begin by saying that, and then I wanted you to have your reflections.
Well, I've written a book about him that has allegations that he was he did a lot of evil to our world, and he did it in conjunction with White House officials at the highest levels, chief of staff, vice president, president. So he was used by powerful people to do deep evil into the church and into our world. I prayed for him, as has Archbishop Vigano, to publicly repent.
Yes.
And confess his sins,
Yes.
so that he receives the absolution of Christ and can face his final judgment as an absolved sinner. I don't think he ever did that. And so I pray that, he moves into his next phase, without damaging anyone else. On my Substack, Midnight in the Laptop of Good and Evil, I've been covering this a lot. I got a letter from James Grine, who was one of his earliest victims, who actually raised the red flag that got McCarrick investigated and delaicized. And he follows me in my Substack. I've emailed back and forth with James. He's a devout man. He's a strong man who's a survivor of clerical sexual abuse. And this is what he has to say about McCarrick. He said this 2 days ago.
Okay.
James Grine says about McCarrick, he remains steadfast about his innocence. He's been evil since 1930, 9 decades of evil. He can no longer discern his actions. In 2018, my deposition kicked a dent in the church. Francis was forever required to laicize him or be fully destroyed himself. Then 2024, Wisconsin state judge required him to stay out of the public eye or go back to court to defend himself. So James Grine had a case against him in Wisconsin that was dismissed because they said McCarrick isn't competent to stand trial. And he didn't get, James Grine wanted his day of justice. That was denied him by that ruling. He's a sad man who lost his way in 1945, God bless all the people he harmed. God bless us for the man he is at Judgment Day. Amen. I agree completely with James Grine. He suffered at this man's hands, and he's been courageous to try to right that wrong and stand up for Jesus' church along the way. So,
Well,
credit to him.
we have a couple of themes that we find in this life, and one is the relation between the U.S. government and the Vatican. It appears that McCarrick served in a liaison role. He would visit the White House, and then he would visit the Vatican. The other is this idea that in some way he's the great example of the problem of the clerical cover-up of the abuse of people, and things are handled on the quiet and very carefully, and the church image is not destroyed, and that this crisis has metastasized in such a way as to destroy the moral authority of the church leadership. Somehow, many, many years ago, there were attempts made starting in 2002 to have procedures installed, one strike and you're out, no simply slapping someone on the wrist and say, you've made a little mistake here, but saying, no, this is unacceptable. These are the most important, the souls of children who are abused are the most important thing of all.
Right.
And somehow the church, year after year, decade after decade, has not seemed to confront this problem of clerical cover-up. So on the two themes, I wondered your thoughts.
Well, on the so McCarrick was the spokesman for the clerical abuse scandal in the 2000s to the media here in Washington.
That's right.
There's a portion of my book where I quote, he did an interview on Meet the Press with Tim Russert. And Tim Russert was a Catholic, a devout Catholic, who was friends with McCarrick. McCarrick said Tim Russert's funeral a few years after he came on his show. I think it was 2000 and maybe it was 2003, 2002, 2004. The date is in my book. But I did a transcription of the passage. I think it's one of the most evil passages that anyone's ever put on Meet the Press. I mean, he basically said, look, the church is full of sinners. We're always going to have sinners in there. We're going to do the best to keep them away from people, but we're going to always have sinners. I mean, it was just like, it's just going to happen. And so this is the guy at the time, I personally believe that people in Washington, the highest levels, media and in politics, knew there were allegations against him in New Jersey. There's a lot of intelligence that comes through Washington, whether you're in, the top secret hearings on the Senate, like Joe Biden was, whether you're in the White House, like President George W. Bush was at the time. And some of that information gets passed on to the media. So I think they knew that there were allegations that this guy McCarrick was part of this. And they put him out there to cover it. And to me, that's also an indication. I've said in my book, I think he was backed by the CIA. I think he was backed by the intelligence community from early on. And I think that's why he got the job to go out there and be the explainer. And that's what he did. And the media allowed it. And they never went back and really dug into it. Mm-hmm. And it was 10 years after, 15 years after this terrible scandal broke out in the early 2000s that James Grine finally got this allegation to come out. I think that happened in 2017. One thing I looked at that was unusual to me was the timing of it. So it happened in 2017 in the spring that the Diocese of New York said, you know what, there's this allegation that he abused this person back then. And I've asked James, when did you file this allegation? Was it filed in the 70s and he just sat on a shelf? And I haven't really heard back. I'm hoping to hear back, maybe now that McCarrick's gone. But the question is, why did it take that long, because the event that led to McCarrick being delaicized occurred in the 70s with James Grine when he was an altar boy as a minor. And so somebody knew about it. He didn't just come out and say it. Maybe he did come out and say it in 2017. And he said, no, this definitely happened. And they interviewed him. It took a long time for them to investigate. It took him a year to investigate once the allegation came out, before he was fully recognized as being this guy who had to be resigned from the College of Cardinals. So one of the things that happened was in the CIA at the time. So this is during President Trump's administration, his first 6 months. Mike Pompeo was the CIA director, and he installed a guy named Burns.
William Burns.
William Burns, who became the Attorney General. William Burns had a lot of background in the CIA, and Pompeo put him in charge of something called the Commission to Advise the CIA or something. It was like an advisory role. Very soon after he gets named. So this is the spring of 2017. Burns comes in, and all of a sudden this allegation comes out. I think this was deep state getting rid of the guy who was the witness that could harm them.
Okay, so you've really made 2 points: that the sins of McCarrick, the crimes of McCarrick, were involving abuse of youngsters and of young seminarians. This was known in the intelligence community. It never was really made public officially. There were no trials, but people whispered about it, and they liked that fact because it was something they could use against him. They had a kind of blackmail they had hanging over his head. And then they started to get closer to him and use him for the purposes that the American government had with regard to the Vatican. That's sort of the scenario that we're hearing about here.
That's right. Yeah, exactly.
So the things he did in his private life ended up affecting everything else. And
right.
Now, people may not know, some people do know, but the allegation, among others, was that he had a little beach house in New Jersey, in Seagirt, on the Atlantic Ocean, on the beach in New Jersey. Somehow it was his own property that he could rent out or go and visit. And he would often, according to the stories, he would take 5 seminarians with him, and there would be 4 single beds in maybe 2 rooms with 2 single beds. And then the 5th seminarian would say, "Where am I going to sleep?" And McCarrick would say, "Well, there'll be space in the master bedroom on the bed where I'm sleeping." And he would invite the seminarian to do that, and the seminarian would hesitate, and he'd say, "Oh, it's nothing wrong about it." And in this way, a type of grooming would occur. And it occurred maybe a number of times. And it could be that there are some people out there who experience this and have never come forward. Because the second aspect of what you said is that no complete and total trial has ever occurred. And even you were saying the James Grine allegations, which date back to the 70s, weren't certainly made until 2017. The fact that these things were known is clear from Vigano's report, where he, in his testimony written in 2018, he wrote his testimony just after all of this unfolds. Grine protests the abuse. The Archdiocese takes it seriously in 2017. In the summer of 2018, they say, "These are serious allegations. We believe they are credible." And the Vatican takes it seriously. You've even intimated that maybe he was being discarded at that time from his protectors.
Right.
We don't know why they finally took it seriously. But Vigano back in 2013, Vigano then in 2018, right after McCarrick is exposed, the crime's taken seriously, the Vatican takes action. He's removed from the cardinalate, and then the next year removed from the priesthood. In the end of August 2018, Vigano publishes his testimony, the 11-page letter where he says, "I went to Francis when he became Pope in May of 2013. And he said this, he said that, he was nuncio in America. He said, how are things in America? And he said, how about McCarrick? And then Vigano responds, well, there's a dossier this thick about McCarrick here in the Vatican, about his activities. He corrupted a generation of seminarians.
Mm-hmm.
Vigano then said Francis, and Pope Benedict took some measures against him. And then Vigano writes that the very next day he ran into McCarrick in the Doma Santa Marta, where the Pope lives, a guest house in the Vatican. And McCarrick says to Vigano, oh, I'm here also to see the new Pope, because he'd been elected in March, now it's May. And he said he's sending me to China to do some negotiation for the Vatican and the Chinese government. Vigano said he was astonished that even as he's telling the Pope that there's a corruption in the past of McCarrick and that Pope Benedict decided he should have no public role, Francis is embracing him as an agent to send in diplomatic mission. That becomes the hinge point for Vigano's declaration that Francis should resign the papacy for not taking action with regard to McCarrick. But the issue then also becomes how completely informed Francis was, and then how completely indispensable McCarrick had made himself, because he'd become known for connections with the U.S. government. He had already been in China, I believe, and thought to be a person who could carry not only the Vatican's message, but the message even of the United States government in negotiating for the Pope. So the Pope thought he was an agent of value, as it were. And he fell into, you could say that he fell into the trap of continuing to use an agent of value who had now passed his expiration date. Too much negative baggage. And this unfolds through 14, 15, 16, and 17.
Right.
Vigano remains the nuncio in Washington until the beginning of 16. The appointments of bishops, etc., are still very liberal under Francis. Vigano is retired. The new nuncio comes in. And then the allegations in 17 against McCarrick come out. And Vigano issues his statement, and it's a standoff. And now we've got 7 more years have passed by, and the church remains in the terrible situation of not having clarity with regard to sexual abuse, and not having clarity with regard to the extent that the church leadership is influenced by foreign powers.
Right. So I'll add a couple of things in there. So after we talked in our last discussion about the Vatican report on Theodore McCarrick.
Yes, I have it right here.
You got it, right? November 10th, 2020. So it comes out right after the election, the stolen election by Joe Biden, right? The report where everybody's curious what was really going on with Theodore McCarrick. And so the Vatican comes out, and it's a whitewash. It's put together by Cardinal Pietro Parolin. Parolin was nominated to be this Vatican Secretary of State in the summer of 2013. I think it was August 2013.
Yes, that's right.
Right. So Vigano goes, he meets with Francis, tells him about this problem with McCarrick. McCarrick gets the green light to go to China. At the time, 2 things about McCarrick. One, he had almost died at the installment of Pope Francis. He talks about this in a video he gave in the fall of 2013. He
Yes, I
gave a
have. We have a yes. He
he
went to Villanova University and he talked about everything that happened at the conclave of 2013. He
right.
did this in October 2013. It's all public. You can find it on the internet.
Yeah. Well, he talks about how he almost died and that the Pope called him and said, "Hey, are you okay?" And McCarrick goes, "Well, I still kicking. I'm still okay." Basically his heart stopped, and they gave him a pacemaker. And so the Pope makes a joke, and he goes, "Oh, well, I guess the devil didn't have his bed ready for you." To me, that's a little indicative of the Pope. But this is Pope Francis, newly named, knowing that McCarrick is one of the bad guys, knowing then, sort of joking about it. And McCarrick almost dies. And yet, within a month, he's back into the White House. He has a meeting with McDonough in the White House in April or May of 2013. And then he's on the road to China for the Vatican. So this is a guy who's determined to do this job. He's not taking time off. He's got a big operation, near-death experience, bounces right back into it. For why? It wasn't for Jesus. He was not working for the church. He was not working for Jesus Christ. He was working for somebody else. And the question I asked throughout the book is, who was McCarrick working for? And was he even working for the Pope? So here's another timeline with the McCarrick, Francis, and the White House. In March of 2013 is when Barack Obama visits the Vatican. He sees Francis in the Vatican. Parolin is the Secretary of State. And by the way, let me just go back into who Parolin is. Parolin came up through the Vatican. He was the nuncio in Nigeria. He was a nuncio in Venezuela, and he was a nuncio in Mexico before he was named Secretary of State. Those are three huge oil-producing countries known for their corruption and cartel activity, especially in Mexico. He was close into that. He moves up the ladder and gets named by Francis and becomes part of this operation to use cartels to traffic children and drugs across the southern border that Francis greenlighted with McCarrick's help and with Obama and Biden. So in March 2014, Obama goes to the Vatican and meets with Francis. At the time, McCarrick is in Iran, meeting with Ayatollahs. This is a secret meeting. It's not announced, but it comes out later. And Obama declares in a press conference after their meeting, we're not talking about anything political, but they were. That's just a bald-faced Obama lie. They put McCarrick and Francis to work on the Iran nuclear deal. That's why McCarrick was talking to the Ayatollahs in Iran. And as soon as Obama leaves, they set up a trip where the Pope goes to the Holy Land and he goes to the West Bank to talk about what's going on with the Iran nuclear deal. This is all behind the scenes. He goes to Israel, talks with Shimon Peres, not Benjamin Netanyahu, Shimon Peres, what's going on with the nuclear deal. And he goes to Jordan. So this is him using the moral authority of the church to pave the way for quote unquote peace in the Middle East, but it's a nuclear deal version of peace that may or may not work for people. And right now, seeing as where the Middle East has gone after the Obama nuclear deal, it hasn't worked for people. So that was 2014. So that was Obama and Biden. And then it gets even worse with the unidentified minors crisis over the summer of 2014.
Well, you've just sketched a very worrisome scenario. I don't know from my own knowledge that these things that you've mentioned are all completely proven. The church may know some things about trafficking, but to say the church engaged in assisting trafficking networks, if that were true, certainly people should be indicted and imprisoned.
Investigated. That's what I call for, is an investigation. And that's what I have in the book is the activities of Cardinal McCarrick and Dennis McDonough in 2014. networked Catholic charities, U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, and Catholic Relief Services into the Obama's Alliance for Prosperity, which was an alliance with one of the countries in the Alliance for Prosperity was Honduras. Their president was then known to be trafficking drugs into the United States through the Sinaloa cartel. That's my point in my book.
Yeah. I mean, we're talking about very sinister and evil things. I did just read a very interesting article by Peter Anderson, who's an old friend. He's about 85 years old now. He's an attorney out in Seattle, Washington, and as an avocation, he's followed Orthodox matters in the Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, Serbian Orthodox, Romanian Orthodox churches, and the Vatican's discussions and meetings with these various churches. And what he mentions in a recent letter he just sent out is that Pope John Paul II had become involved with something called the Icon of Kazan. Kazan is a city about 600 miles east of Moscow. I've been there several times, and I too was involved in this story. We were looking for the Icon of Kazan because it was called the protection of Russia for centuries. And it was lost at the time of the Russian Revolution. And when Russia became officially atheist and churches were destroyed and icons were either destroyed or sold to art dealers. And this was one of those items that got sold to the West. It ended up on a English nobleman's wall in England, and a Russian Orthodox bishop was visiting the house in the 1950s and said, "That's the icon of Kazan on your wall." He said, "Yes, I got it from an art dealer." And he said, "Well, this is a very precious icon to the Russians. We'd like to get it and then bring it back to Russia." And they tried to collect money. He wanted to sell it to them, and then someone stole the money. But sometime in the 60s, this story reached the Blue Army of Our Lady of Fatima. And the Blue Army initiated a collection of funds to try to buy this icon and get it back eventually into the hands of the Catholic Church, but with the goal eventually of getting it back to create better relations with the Russian Orthodox. And a chaplain for the Blue Army was Theodore McCarrick. And this icon was purchased and taken to Fatima, and it was a little chapel was built for it there next to the main church in Fatima. And the Russians started to hear about this in underground conversation, and they started to visit and make pilgrimage, not only to Fatima, but to the little chapel where the protection of Russia, this beautiful icon of Our Lady and the child Jesus, was preserved. Suddenly, Gorbachev announces the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and in Christmas of 1991. Early in 1992, Pope John Paul II contacts Theodore McCarrick, who's now the Archbishop of Newark, where he will visit in 1995. And McCarrick goes to Portugal and deals with the nuncio in Portugal, and on behalf of the Blue Army of Our Lady of Fatima, they hand the icon over to the Vatican nuncio, who carries it to Pope John Paul II, and it's placed in his apartment. Pope John Paul II had a deep devotion to this icon, prayed in front of it, and continued to seek a way already in the 90s to carry it himself back to Russia and return to the Russian Orthodox people the icon of Our Lady of Kazan. He never was able to do that. I had several discussions about how it might be done. I went to the Pope's apartment. I saw the icon with my own eyes. I have said this on other occasions that I experienced a type of vertigo as I felt this icon has a kind of profound spiritual power. And the image of Our Lady in the icon is a mixture of serenity and severity.
Hmm.
You couldn't tell whether she was the severe mother or whether she was the very kind and forgiving mother.
Hmm.
And that was the icon that the Russian czars called for when they had armies assaulting Moscow, whether the Poles or the Swedes, and they would hold the icon up and pray for the protection of Russia, which is why it became known as the protection of Russia.
Hmm.
And I said to the Pope's secretary, how is the icon returned? He said, we're trying to get an agreement that he land in Kazan on his way to the Far East and on the tarmac hand over the icon. But both here and there, we feel that it's not dignified enough, and it's not officially recognizable as a church-to-church act. It's kind of a handover in the night.
Hmm.
Then John Paul gets more and more tired, older and older, and in the summer of 2004, realizes he's never going to have a trip to Russia. And then he calls Theodore McCarrick and Cardinal Walter Casper, who's the head of the congregation or the Council for Christian Unity. And he says, I would like the two of you to take the icon to Moscow and hand it over.
Wow.
And McCarrick, with all his connections, with all his baggage, carries out this mission for John Paul II on the 28th of August, 2004. 2004. John Paul will die 6 months later in April 2nd, just a few days ago, April 2nd, 2005, 20 years ago. And McCarrick, therefore, according to Peter Anderson, in this article just published a couple of days ago, maybe it was yesterday, had an affection for McCarrick.
He had an affection for
McCarrick. He felt
the Pope had an affection.
Yeah,
Pope Francis.
He felt McCarrick had played a crucial role in this interchurch relationship, Catholic Orthodox relationship, Vatican-Russian relationship. And he had played that role all the way from the early 90s when he brought the icon from Portugal to the 2004 transfer of the icon to the former Soviets.
Hmm.
And this is what Peter Anderson says tended to distort John Paul II's vision of McCarrick and not take so seriously the allegations against him, and impose the decision even against the will of Cardinal John O'Connor, the wonderful. I knew John O'Connor, and he's a saint, in my view. He was always a loving, kind, balanced, careful, and holy man. And he said to the Pope in the late 90s, when they were thinking of choosing the next cardinal for Washington, maybe better not choose McCarrick. But the Pope decided, nevertheless, to appoint McCarrick Cardinal Archbishop of Washington. How do we explain all these things? Peter Anderson says that there's a series of how do we call them, layers of the onion here. There's the U.S. government that's trying to do something to, one way or another, it's got a policy toward the former Soviet Union.
Right.
And it's either to encircle and diminish it, or it's else to make friendship and an alliance with it. And these two strands of our foreign policy alternate now in the last 10 years between the Obama neocon policy and the Trump sort of more favorable to Russia policy, which we've watched in front of our eyes with great puzzlement for the most part, don't you think?
I understand what Trump's doing with Russia.
You do.
Can I ask, what was the date of the return of the icon again? It was 2004?
August 28th.
Okay.
So McCarrick goes to Moscow with Walter Casper, and they carry the icon. There are pictures on the internet of them handing it over to Patriarch Alexei II.
So an ex-White House stenographer who worked for the press office would see that August 28th, 2004 date as being beneficial to the Bush re-election campaign of 2004. It's right in that timeline.
That's right.
Week before. Yep. So maybe that had a role in it. Maybe the Bush people said, hey, yeah, let's do this and let's have McCarrick do it. They liked McCarrick. He was one of their, global ambassadors to China. So maybe that was part of it.
So one strand we're seeing here is that the government has plans. Sometimes we don't even know what those plans are, but then they have resources in the business community, in the media community, maybe even in the film community in Hollywood. But they also have resources inside religious institutions, and therefore there's a multifaceted effort to carry out secular policy while at the same time the Holy Spirit is attempting to guide the Catholic Church in between the powers of this world, to be in the world but not of the world.
Right.
And this is why McCarrick becomes a fascinating figure. And then each of the papacies becomes fascinating as well, because they have to make some type of modus vivendi, way of living, with the secular powers.
Right.
And they kind of change decade and century after century. Whether, Napoleon comes in and takes the Pope away from Rome, makes him a prisoner, brings him to Paris. They take all the manuscripts of the Vatican Library for about 10 years. And then Napoleon is defeated. France, if they had won at Waterloo, would have been what Britain became. And also were defeated by the Russians. People don't forget that if Napoleon had defeated Russia, he would have probably been the emperor of Europe, not just of France. It would have been. So I'm just giving one example, but the papacy for him was something to control, to imprison. And he even told the Pope, he said, the church will not survive any longer. It's the modern mentality of humanity expressed by the French philosophers, the Enlightenment, etc., has taken us beyond this benighted and superstitious religious faith. And the Pope said, no, we will be preserved and protected till the end of time.
Right.
Anyway, McCarrick, we have a couple of slides. I wonder if we could just work through the life of Theodore McCarrick. And could we have one of the slides? Theodore Edward McCarrick, former Metropolitan Archbishop of Washington, D.C., who was dismissed from the clerical state in 2019 for sexual abuse of adults and minors, has died at the age of 94. The former cardinal departed this life on April 3rd, this year, 2025.
Yeah.
There's an error, 2025, 4 days ago, in the U.S. state of Missouri, where he had been living in seclusion since 2020. So that's the departure of McCarrick. Here he is toward the end of his life. Disgraced former Cardinal Theodore McCarrick, seen in this 2011 file photo. So this is 14 years ago. Yeah. Died April 3rd at age 94. McCarrick was laicized in 2019 after public allegations of serial sexual misconduct. He became the highest-ranking Catholic cleric in the U.S. to face criminal charges for sexual abuse. This is the moment when he's at Villanova University in October of 2013. Pope Benedict has resigned in February. Pope Francis is elected in March. This is McCarrick, who was present in Rome at that time and also in and out of the White House, which I'd like you to comment on again. This is him giving a talk at Villanova University. As I said, there's a video of this on the internet where he talks about what he did during the conclave of 2013. McCarrick, or Uncle Ted, as he had his victims call him. That's kind of a tragic fact.
Yeah.
Call me Uncle Ted. Was once known as the kingmaker of the American Catholic Church. He is said to have orchestrated the appointment of several prelates, including Cardinal Donald Wuerl, Cardinal Blaise Supich, Cardinal Joseph Tobin, who's now in Newark, where McCarrick used to be, Cardinal Kevin Farrell, who's now the Camerlengo in Rome for the overseeing of the sede vacante, when the see is vacant after the passing of the Pope. One man will have the authority to organize the conclave. That man is Kevin Farrell.
Oh.
And Cardinal Robert McElroy, who was in San Diego, but is now again the Cardinal of Washington, where McCarrick was. He even boasted of influencing Francis' elevation to the papacy. You can find his October 2013 lecture at Villanova University, in which he makes this claim, on YouTube. Okay. And then this is the moment when everything fell apart for McCarrick and became a tragedy for him and for our church, although in some ways maybe there was something good that came of this, a kind of clarity and truth, I think. Don't you think, Mike?
Yeah, the truth is God's word, and I think God is working his way through our process to get his word out, despite what evildoers are doing to prevent it.
All right, so there we are. We think then of the summer of 2018 as the turning point between not knowing and knowing in our church. On July 27th, 2018, McCarrick was ordered by Pope Francis to observe a life of prayer and penance in seclusion, and the Pope accepted his resignation from the College of Cardinals. The Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith in a church penal process found McCarrick guilty of solicitation in the sacrament of confession. What they're saying is that he was engaging in a kind of personal relationship or seeking one during confession, and sins against the sixth commandment with minors and with adults, with the aggravating factor of the abuse of power. In August, so just a couple weeks later, a year later, August 2019, McCarrick, still maintaining his innocence, said, "I do not believe that I did the things that they accused me of," close quote. Any reaction to that, Mike?
Well, I mean, that's what James Grine wrote in his email, in his comment on my Substack. Yeah, he did those things and he never admitted to it. So this is him not confessing publicly. I mean, in August 2019, I think Archbishop Pagano had written a letter to him after writing these letters about what he told Pope Francis. I don't remember if it was 2019 or 2018.
I think in 2018 already, right after he issued his testimony, I think it was the 24th of August, in September of 2018, he wrote several other letters. He started this process of writing letters, which has continued to this day.
Right.
And he wrote an open letter to McCarrick. You can find it. We could perhaps even bring it up. But he said, please come forward, confess, and make, for the sake of your own soul, but also for the whole church.
Right.
And it would be a cleansing and a purification, a repentance. And it is true. There's always a need for this, probably in every life, Mike, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. We all are sinners. Confession is really important. It's one of the best sacraments in the church, I believe. I got to get there pretty soon. I was there around Christmas. I got to get back in there.
Okay. No, I think that Jesus actually, when you study his life, you look at the scriptures, he was forgiving people their sins. They were confessing, he was forgiving. Right. And the scribes and Pharisees said he can't do that. Only God can do that. And they started to prepare to arrest him and to imprison him or to execute him, partly because he forgave sins and claimed to be able to do so. I think the key center of his ministry was this question of sin. And he started his whole ministry saying, repent. And so did John the Baptist. And our society has a great need of that. we're filled with crimes and sins that are then covered up and never repented of and never compensated for.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, that's exactly what McCarrick represents, and he never confessed.
In 2023,
and Pope
yeah.
Francis hasn't confessed either. I've been praying for Pope Francis to publicly confess too. So let's see what he does.
I'm sorry, I just clipped the button myself. In 2023, yeah, Francis is in the final stages of his life, and so we may, if the Spirit moves him, we may get something from him that none of us expect. In 2023, a Massachusetts court found McCarrick not competent to stand trial for sexual abuse because his progressive and irreparable cognitive deficits rendered him unable to meaningfully consult with counsel or to effectively assist his own defense. In 2024, it was reported McCarrick had dementia, which resulted in a criminal case against him in Washington.
In Wisconsin,
being dismissed.
That's what James Grine was referring to in his post.
So this is the man toward the end of his life, former cardinal. He's now no longer a cardinal nor a priest. Former Cardinal Theodore E. McCarrick arrives at the Dedham District Court in Dedham, Massachusetts on September 3rd, 2021, almost 4 years ago, after being charged with molesting a 16-year-old boy during a 1974 wedding reception.
Right.
And 2021 was still the time when everyone was wearing masks. He's using a what do we call that? A stroller.
Yeah, walker.
And he's going into the court. And now we see him in better times, you might say, or maybe even worse times, depending on your point of view. This is in his authority as the Cardinal Archbishop of Washington, D.C., the representative of the Catholic Church, probably the highest single representative in the United States, because it is the city of our government. Put there by John Paul II. We talked about that a little while ago.
Right.
President George Bush, on the left, walks out of St. Matthew's Cathedral, right there in the middle of Washington, with Cardinal Theodore McCarrick, and also Supreme Court Chief Justice John Roberts, after attending the 52nd Annual Red Mass in Washington, D.C., Sunday, October 2nd, 2005. It's almost 20 years ago.
Right. So quick bit of White House history from the White House person who was in there. This is a month after Hurricane Katrina has decimated New Orleans. And the Bush administration is struggling to get some decent public relations, positive public relations. This looks like, to me, that's what this is. This is Bush walking out, and McCarrick is only too happy to assist him. They get a public picture with the Supreme Court Justice. Supreme Court Justice Roberts is Catholic, Bush is Methodist, and there they are. So, there's a lot of, every time something happens with a president, you got to ask why, right? What's the public relations message they're trying to get? That may have been it. Let's make him look good standing next to Theodore McCarrick.
All right. So here we are, Mike, and we're going to wrap up this conversation on the death of Cardinal Theodore McCarrick, no longer a cardinal. A man who had a high role in the church, a man who was respected and even loved by many, and who somehow betrayed the trust of many. And was a figure that also was a kind of bridge between the American government and the Vatican, to the extent that some people, and even you, think that he may have been an actual agent of our intelligence agency.
Right.
That in some way protected him as well over the years.
Yep.
Okay. Um, why don't you just offer a final reflection on the life of this man and on what it means for us and how we go forward?
Well, I think you're looking at a lot of personal turmoil in this person's conduct. We had the same thing in our national identity over that course of period of time, late 50s through the 60s, 70s, 80s, into 2000. It culminated with the crisis of the shutdowns by the COVID-19, what I call the fake pandemic, the plandemic. So what role did the church play in that time? There were some really good aspects. The fall of the Soviet Union was put together. I think the Vatican and the CIA worked together hand in glove in that. There was a lot of activity between the two that they worked together. It sounds like that icon you were talking about was part of that. That was probably a project, and they used McCarrick to help it along. So, good things, but also behind it, beneath it all, was this percolating culture of evil, where you had these cardinals and these bishops perpetrating sexual abuse, priests perpetrating sexual abuse. So the church has to come clean. Who were these people? Who were they working for? Who was Pope Francis? Who was he working for? And we got to get to the truth. The truth is God's word. And when you speak the truth, God is on your side. So that's what we got to keep doing. Just telling the truth about what happened.
Okay, we have just a couple of people here at the last. E-Catholic 2, this is just my opinion. I'm convinced our blessed Lord allowed them radically alter holy orders so men like McCarrick would have doubtful holy orders. God protected his church. Well, that's a dramatic statement. I think we can discuss that more in future. Palermo Trapani, Catholic. Sorry, I can't read it very clearly because my eyes are getting. He entered seminary in 1950 and was ordained in May of 58 when Pope Pius XII was still Pope. He was trained in seminary pre-Vatican II and ordained prior to that. So I do think we must have a type of renewal and restoration and reform of our church. We do have wonderful priests and wonderful bishops. It's a complicated world. There's infiltrations into all of our families, all of our communities. We receive information as we're doing this podcast. There's dozens, hundreds, thousands, hundreds of thousands. People are sending information around the world. There's various abusive things that occur to children throughout our society. The church should be a sanctuary. It should be led by people who are dedicated to sacrificing everything in order to protect the souls of individuals and to be a witness in the world to the work of Jesus Christ, which was to save souls. The political and the cultural ramifications of this are multiple, but we can't have compromise with sin, with abuse, and still retain our moral authority. Therefore, we must have a thorough cleansing.
Yeah, we have to purify the church. We got to purify the church.
And that will be the subject of our next conversation. We'll have different proposals for how that could be done. Mike, it's great always to talk to you. You know so much. You've suffered a good deal, I think. And you've watched as a kind of very, very important eyewitness to people coming in and out of the White House.
Yeah, the White House role and what's happened over the course of our lives is significant. And, I say this a lot. Evil happens right in front of you. You don't understand it until you dig into it. So that's what we're doing. And I appreciate you having me on to talk about this with your audience.
All right. Best wishes, Mike, and farewell.
Thanks, Robert.